Now, Home Assistant is a really cool tool for your home automation. Not only for the visualization, but also for automating a lot of stuff and integrating many different systems together. And one system that you can integrate into Home Assistant is KNX. And in this video you will see how you can connect KNX into Home Assistant. And with that, hi and welcome back to my channel, to this new video. So in this video we want to take a look at how we can connect Home Assistant to KNX. So for example, do you use Home Assistant as visualization for KNX, to use it for automations, or to connect it to other systems like Zigbee, etc. But in this video, we first of all want to establish a connection between Home Assistant and KNX and create some entities, mainly a lighting entity and some additional entities. So first of all, therefore, I have a fresh Home Assistant installation. Now, of course, you don't have to use a fresh Home Assistant installation, just use the one that you have. And I also have a little KNX installation with already some functions being programmed. And those functions I now want to integrate into Home Assistant. And therefore, that's pretty straightforward to set KNX up into Home Assistant. You simply go to Settings, Devices and Services, click on Add Integration down below, and here we can simply search for KNX. And now the only thing that the integration needs to know is how it should connect to KNX. Now for the beginning, the automatic connection type is fully sufficient. However, if you use, for example, KNX Secure or Data Secure, then you would have to set it up manually. But for now, let us use the automatic connection type. By the way, if you want to know more about connecting KNX to Home Assistant, then I'll suggest you to check out my brand new video course, the KNX Home Assistant Primer. This is the English version of my successful German video course, and in there you will learn everything that you need to know about connecting KNX to Home Assistant. So for example, we'll take a look at how we can use KNX Secure in Home Assistant. We'll see how we can use KNX inside of Home Assistant automations and blueprints. And we'll also see how we can connect external systems like Zigbee via Home Assistant to KNX and a lot more. So in the video description down below and also in the pinned comment, I have linked you this video course over on Udemy, also with a little coupon code so that you can save a little bit of money. So if you want to know more about it and want to support this video channel and also the videos I'm creating here, then feel free to check out this coupon code, and I'm more than happy to see you in the video course. Before I click here on submit, let us quickly take a look at what exactly do we need to connect Home Assistant to KNX. So as you see here, we either need a KNX IP interface or a KNX IP router. One of those two devices you need in your KNX installation so that Home Assistant can connect to it via the network. Because Home Assistant doesn't use a KNX twisted pair connection, it instead uses either a tunneling connection or KNX IP. So you either need a KNX IP interface, and this is what you maybe should check if you have KNX devices that also have an Ethernet connection, then you should check if this might not already have a KNX IP interface inside of it. So for example, here in my case, I have a Gira X1 on my demo board, which I use. And this device is basically a KNX visualization server, but it also has already integrated a KNX IP interface, which I can use here for. And you can check that pretty easily by simply going into the EDS and click here on this little terminal icon. And here you can see all the connections the EDS6 found. And here you can see I have two KNX IP routers with a tunneling connection and also a Gira X1 and a S1 that I can use. And the other option is that you use a KNX IP router instead and there directly communicate via KNX IP. So those are the two options. In my case, for the beginning, we simply click here on Automatic, click on Submit, and with that you can see that Home Assistant used the first interface that it found, in my case here the Gira X1, which is fully sufficient. I click here on Finish, and with that we can see that we have KNX integrated into Home Assistant. Pretty simple. Of course, the first integration, but now we need to create the entities. So what we first of all can see is that there are already some entities that we can see here that are basically informations about our connection. So whether the connection is established, how many telegrams were sent, etc. So those are information that we could use, for example, in an automation. But with that in place, what we can also see is that here in the sidebar, we now have a new entry called KNX. And if I click on that, we have the KNX user interface, or user interface of the KNX integration. And here the first thing that I will do is that I'll import my EDS project file. Because what Home Assistant does is that it uses the KNX project file, checks it for the group addresses that were created and also devices that are inside of the project, so that we can then use those group addresses here in Home Assistant. So therefore what I have to do is that I'll head over to the EDS6 in my dashboard, click here on export on my project. Now depending on your project size, this might take a little time. So with the export being successful, I can head over to Home Assistant and import the project file here. Then in my case I have a password. Click on submit, and now this project file is being uploaded onto my Home Assistant server. Now don't worry, this project file isn't stored on your server or in any cloud. It's just used to read out the group addresses and the devices, and then it's being deleted in your server. And with that, you can now see here the EDS project data with all the informations, and with that we now have some additional options here. So first of all, we have the group monitor. And in here you can see that, that's basically a group monitor with all the telegrams that Home Assistant receives or sends out. So here you can see I have my weather station sending out the wind speed, brightness, and all the other informations. Here in between I have a server which isn't recognized because it isn't in my KNX file. This shouldn't be the case. However, we will ignore it for now. And then here you can see some additional telegrams. So that's a pretty handy feature, because with the group monitor here, you don't need to open up the EDS every time only to see where the Home Assistant sends telegrams. Now, next up we have the project window. And here we can basically see all the informations that Home Assistant read out of our project file. So the group addresses, here we can also see the last values that were sent. And we can also search here for group addresses. So for example, living room, and then we can see all the group addresses for the living room. And last but not least, basically the most important window in here is the entities window, because in here we can create entities. And at the time of recording, these are the 3 entities that we can create via the user interface. Now don't worry, there are also other entities available that we can create via KNX, but only via the YAML files in this case. So these 3 we can create via the user interface, or the others via the YAML file. And so therefore let us start by creating a light entity. So I click here, and then we can see the configuration of this entity type. And basically what we need to do is that we need to set up our addresses. So here you can see we can use this light entity either for a switchable light, a dimmable light, and also for color controlled light. Now in my case, I want to start slowly by simply creating a switchable light. And so therefore I click in here, and then I can search for living room, and in here I have the ceiling light on off. Then the state address is 101, so living ceiling on off status. So in this case, we don't need any brightness information, color control, etc. And then I can give this entity a name. Now here in my case, living room ceiling. Then I'll hit on create. And with that, we have created our first entity. So if I click here on this little information icon, we can see that the light is currently on. And now we can turn it on, off, and I can already hear it clicking behind me. If I go to the group monitor, we can see that Home Assistant sent the telegrams onto the bus. So that's pretty straightforward. So therefore let us create an additional light entity, now with a dimmable light. So now again I have the light in the living room, and in here I have the living room spots. So spots on off. So I can also search simply for spots on off status. And then here we have the brightness group addresses. So not the dim group address for relative control, but for absolute control, so the dim value that we send to the dim actuator. And you might have already seen it here on the right hand side. We can see all the devices that Home Assistant recognized. And if I click on a device, so here in my dimming actuator, we can see that here we can also see the group objects that this device has and also the connected group addresses to it. And you can also see that the integration highlights where we can use this group address. So here in brightness we need a DPT5 group address, so therefore I can't connect a status on-off 1-bit address to it. But I can use here my dim value status, which is the state, and then we have the dim value, so here this object as the sending address. Now with that we can give it a name, so living room ceiling. And then what you might have already seen is that we can also create devices. Now I don't want to go into much detail, but devices are basically a group of multiple entities belonging to one device. Now you might come to the idea that here you will simply create the KNX devices that you have, so the switching actuator with all its outputs. But I wouldn't use it in that way. I would use it sort of as virtual devices. So for example, if you have a complex light control in KNX with a presence detector that you can also lock with some additional thresholds that you can set up, then I would create a device named, for example, living room spotlight, and then connect all the entities or associate all the entities to it that you use for this complex control inside of KNX. At the moment, you can also only hook up those entities to devices that you can create via the user interface. So light entities, switch entities, and binary sensors. Therefore, at the moment, it isn't really that useful, but when more entities are coming to the user interface, this of course will get much more interesting. Now, long story short, let us give it a name, living room spot, click on create. And with that, I have also created this entity in here. And if I click here on this more info, you can also see that Home Assistant already read out the value or the dimming value, and I can now control it via Home Assistant. So you can see 85%, and if I go into the group monitor, we can see Home Assistant sending 85%. So with that now working, I'll also want to show you how you can create entities via the YAML file, because I think that's also really important, especially at the moment where we can't create that many entity types with the user interface. And what I can really recommend you is that you take a look at the official documentation. So simply search for KNX and Home Assistant, and then go to the first link here, so KNX Home Assistant, and in here you will get detailed informations about what you can set up in which entity type. So those are all the entity types that we can create via the KNX integration. So you can see there is a lot of entity types that are available. And the entity that I want to create now together with you is the cover entity. And if you simply click on cover here, you can already see that we get to the correct position of the site. And in here you can see first of all some description, but also some sample code, which I'll simply use. So I hit here copy and then go into my Visual Studio Code server. So I was lying at the beginning because I have already installed something, and that was in the settings via add-ons, the Visual Studio Code server. So simply click here on add-on store and search for Visual Studio Code server, and then you can install it. In my case, I need to update it, but I will do that after the video. Now in my Visual Studio Code server, I can go into the configuration.yaml, and now what I want to do, because I don't want to enter all my KNX code in this configuration YAML, is I'll simply do KNX and then include knx.yaml. So with that, I'll need to create a new file called knx.yaml, and in here I will set up all my configuration. So I simply hit paste because I copied it from here. And now because I am in an additional file, I now don't need this entry KNX because I already set it up here in the main file, so configuration YAML. And then we only need this code here. So cover. And then down below here we have the first entry. So what that basically is, as we can see here at the beginning, is that cover is basically an array with multiple entries, and these entries are objects consisting of multiple configuration key value pairs. That's some basic knowledge about YAML. So if we have an additional shutter, then we simply first of all copy it, and this additional shutter is then basically started with this minus here at the beginning. I'll quickly delete it. And now what do we need to set up here? Well, first of all, obviously the name. In my case, living room shutter. And then we have the group addresses that we need to specify. So here we have move long address and move short address. That are basically the group addresses that you have in KNX also for the control via a push button. So if I go into the EDS, in my project, into my group addresses, lines, ground floor, we can see that here we have the up, down and the stop group address that are basically this long button press and short button press. So here I have the 200 and the 201. Then we have an additional entry called stop address. In my case, that's also 201. I'll come back to that later. Then we have the position address, and this is now also for the absolute control. So when we have a slider element in Home Assistant, then we send, for example, the value 50%. So in the EDS, this is here the group address height. So 202 and 204. But now one thing is missing. I don't really have the address for my lamellas. And that's because basically this isn't used here in this example. But if we scroll down a little bit further, we can see that there is a lot of more configuration. And here we can see the angle address and angle state address that is used for the lamella position. So I'll simply copy it. So angle address. In my case, this was 203. And then we have the angle stop address being at 205. So with that set up, you might ask yourself, why do I have to specify the traveling time? Because basically the actuator will send us the value at which position it is in KNX. Yeah, that's true. However, in Home Assistant, we will shortly see that in the visualization, if I set, for example, the blind to 20%, then it's constantly moving. However, in KNX, a blind actuator will only send a value or a response after the movement is finished. So therefore, this wouldn't work. And because of that, we set up the traveling time also in here so that Home Assistant can roughly estimate at which position the blind currently is. Don't worry, at the end of the movement, the position being sent by the blind actuator then is used. So this traveling time is only really needed for the animation in between. So where do I get that from? Well, basically, I'll check my blind actuator where I've set up that. So in my case, I go to the topology in my twisted pair line, and here I have this actuator, which consists of multiple modules, a binary input, a dimming actuator, and also a switching actuator that I can use for blinds. And then down below here, we have my blind channel. And there I can see, if I go to driver settings, I have set it to 20 seconds up and down. So 20 and 20. So with that set up, I can simply hit save, go into my developer tools, and first of all check my configuration. And you can see I have made a mistake. And that's obviously, it's not called angle stop, but angle state address. So I go into Visual Studio Code Server and name it state address. Check the config. And now, after you install KNX in Home Assistant, we also have this Restart KNX option here. With that, if I click here, we can go back to the overview, and in here we now have this cover entity. So if I click on it and use, for example, here 20%, I can click it, hear it clicking behind me, and you can see that this is the animation that I talked about. So this animation now, there it uses the traveling time that I set up. So as you can see, it's working pretty fine. We are at 20 seconds, and now I can also use here this angle movement. Now if I go here on this button, you can see that here we have the normal button control, so up, stop, and here the short button press for the angle. And with that, we have basically set up also our cover entity. So with that, I head back to the Studio Code server, and here I have still one question open. Why do we have the stop address and also the move short address? Well, that's basically because the cover entity in Home Assistant is used for blinds, but also for shutters. So shutters where you can only move up and down, and blinds where you can also control the lamella. And if you have a shutter, then you don't need this move short address. Then you only use the stop address. So what I'll do is I quickly comment out this angle address here, so to simulate that it would be a cover, and then I'll use the stop address. If I now go to the settings and restart KNX, we can see that here we now have the shutter, so we can only control the height. And here we also only have the options for moving up, stopping and down. But if I go back into the Studio Code server and now use the short address instead of the stop address, if I save it and restart KNX, we can see that now already here this icon changed to a blind, and now here in the button control we also have this angle buttons, even though we have only a shutter. So if you have a shutter, then you use the stop address, and if you have a blind, you use the short address. So with that set up, I hope that with this video I got to show you how you can use Home Assistant together with KNX. So the first steps on how to create entities via the user interface and also via YAML. Now, if you want to know more about Home Assistant and KNX, then don't hesitate to check out my brand new video course on Udemy. I would be really happy to welcome you in there. And otherwise, if you have any wishes or any video suggestions, especially in combination with Home Assistant and KNX, but also other video suggestions about KNX, then let me know in the comment section down below. And with that, I would say, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to be informed about new videos, and also hit the like button if this video was helpful for you. And with that, I will see you in the next video. So, bye bye.